Yeah, I think we figured about an hour and a half, so, or an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, questions? Stunned?
I have a question for you. At a couple of points, you mentioned a few things that you thought were shortcomings of our Constitution. I think you mentioned one about the clarity of the writing, how it could be twisted. There's one of them I can't remember right now, but are there any others?
Well, that's a big one. The basic problem is that the Constitution was written in the legal English of 1787, which is not the language we use today. English in those days, and legal English in particular, was somewhat sloppy. It was midway in its evolution as a language between the language of today and the language of Shakespeare. You can imagine trying to conduct law or business or a scientific conference in the language of Shakespeare. Very good for poetry and lovemaking, and not so good for those more precise fields. English was not always the language of the courts. Until the early 1700s, French and law Latin were, or law French and Latin. It was only at that time that it began to be allowed to introduce English into the courts. And that began the transformation of English into a language containing legal jargon, a lot of which had to be translated from the Latin or law French, which explains why a lot of the words we use in law today have the form that they do. And of course, they also didn't have a lot of the concepts that we've developed since then to make our thinking more precise. So if we were writing the Constitution today, I think we would do it somewhat differently. Unfortunately, it would also probably be a lot longer, because a lot of the clarity that if we discovered is needed requires just more verbiage. Just as contracts evolve from short, simple, one-page ones to, hundreds of pages, so it is that constitutions probably need to evolve into larger, longer documents in order to avoid being misinterpreted.
So that brings up a potential problem, which we already have with everyday contracts, which is that nobody bothers to take the time to read them. And so it seems to me that there's something of a trade-off here, which is that the more detailed and explicit the document becomes, the more boring it becomes, and the less likely anybody is to actually pay attention to what it has to say.
Yeah, until something goes wrong. Then all of a sudden it says, but I didn't read that.
And we not violate one of the principles which you had on your slide, saying that it should not go into the details.
Yeah.
Cover the principle.
Yeah, but to the extent that it says anything at all, it should be as clear as possible. Right.
A little more about the very interesting Durful concept and how it is still applied and where.
You mean Dustur? Of Madina? Yeah, it's not really applied. That's the problem. Versions of it were applied in a few places like ancient Palestine, especially during the time of the Crusades. For a while the Muslims were in charge of Palestine, they adopted something similar to allow Jews, Christians, Muslims, and perhaps even pagans, although there was no mention of them. There were some Mongols, to live together in relative harmony. And in the Ottoman Empire, there was a similar arrangement that was tolerant of various religious groups. But that was always somewhat unstable. The Dustur al-Madina is probably the best example of something that was once tried and really ought to be serve as a basis for use by moderns.
Well, John, I question the idea of natural rights. You mentioned a natural right to life and limb. The other day I saw a hawk grab and capture and kill a grackle and eat it. And I assert that that grackle had no right to its life nor any right to its limb. It's the
Well,
state
of
of
course.
nature. Where does rights come in?
Well, remember, these are rights against the actions of government, against the actions of our servants who exercise powers that we delegated to them. That doesn't really apply to the realm of private action. Now, in the realm of private action, the grackle would have grounds for either a criminal complaint or, perhaps a lawsuit for the tort. Okay, but so the hawk didn't have a right exactly, but that was the behavior of predators and prey in the natural environment. They're doing what they naturally tend to do.
So how does this apply to human beings?
Because human beings appoint people to be their officials,
And once they do
and
that,
they impose restrictions on what they can do with their power.
once they do that, they're no longer in the state of nature. They're in the state of
Exactly.
society. Hence, there are no natural rights.
No, it's just that the natural rights serve as a foundation for the claims within the social contract.
But without the social
In other
contract,
words-
they don't exist.
Without the social contract, we don't have no defense, right, other than our own strength.
So there are no natural rights. There are only rights by convention.
Well, it's a claim. It's a right in the sense that it's something that people are naturally, or animals are naturally going to tend to claim. Whether they can enforce them is another matter. In the state of nature, the only enforcement is your own efforts.
Let me throw something out here and you can tell me whether you agree with it. All men are created equal, for example, as a statement of fact, false. But it's not a statement of fact, it's a political demand.
Mhm.
Would natural rights work the same way? This is what we believe ought to be the case.
Yes, because of course, until you get some kind of adjudication mechanism, there is no forum in which to assert a right. But that doesn't mean that you're not looking back to what you wanted in the state of nature to assert a claim.
Can you not see it as a more like a...
Oh, wait, let me move this side of the room here.
I didn't know the Germans started off with the common law. Do you have any idea why they threw it off to adopt the Roman civil law, which they apply today?
Well, mainly because they're being dominated for a while by the Holy Roman Empire. Remember in the Renaissance period, this was an empire headquartered in Rome, which dominated the German states for a period of time. But the tradition continued at the local level. But before the Holy Roman Empire, there had been German tribes that moved to England, carrying their traditions with them. And it's there that they survived in a more pure form.
So, on your section on the social contracts, you started out with the contract between the parent and child. Maybe if the child not with the parent. Is that what the social contracts mitigate on based on, grounded in?
Exactly.
And can you explain that maybe the child other than the parent understand?
Well, that's basically what the relationship is between a parent and child.
How about
If
kids would do that?
if a child was sufficiently bad, the parent would probably kill him. If the parent was sufficiently bad, the child might kill the parent if he could. Right, there are species where parents prey on their children, especially during times of duress. But to have a society, you have to have a starting point, and the starting point is the filial contract.
Is that natural? I mean, where is that?
It is natural, yes.
I would say
That doesn't mean it's always complied with, but that's the default behavior of most normal beings, Leonard.
You listed, you had a slide called the militia with several bullet points. Now, I'd be interested in knowing how the bullet points that you list for the militia differ from what the founding fathers wrote in our Constitution.
Well, actually, it complies with them. It doesn't comply with much of what's been
Well, I know
written
that they
since
go
then.
into the detail that you,
No, they don't go into that much detail, right?
so you're projecting on their intentions, or how do you arrive at all of this based on the Constitution?
Well, you can find all of that in, for example, militia statutes they adopted. Now, in the case of the clearest example would be the Militia Act of 1792.
And what exactly is a militia in their terms, historically?
Well, the militia is several things. First of all, there's a subset of militia, sometimes just referred to as militia, who are those who may be required to respond to a call-up. And originally, 17 to 45. In some states, it's like 14 to 60 or so forth. That doesn't mean others can't participate, but those are the ones who may be penalized if they don't respond.
So you're talking about a standby army, basically.
Yes, but not just the army. The original concept of militia from ancient Latin was defense activity, because militia could be used for disaster response as well as for defense and law enforcement. So the same guys, so the same militia could put out a fire, or try to fight a flood, or just go out and arrest somebody for committing armed robbery or something. It was only later that those kinds of functions were separated out into different organizations. Wait.
Sorry, I got lost a little bit between descriptive and normative. In the beginning of your lecture, you clearly, in descriptive mode, you were telling how things were done in certain parts of the world at a certain time, and perhaps some underlying principle was how that led to that. And in the end, it wasn't clear to me, are you describing the principles that in fact exist somewhere, or you're proposing things that ought to be from a certain point of view? So,
Well, I'm mainly talking about behaviors that tend to reemerge even if they're not always followed. Like people who might deviate from the rules of chess might, after a period of unsatisfactory play, return to the standard rules of chess. We have many examples of national constitutions that often many imitative of successful and enforced constitutions that nevertheless are not enforced in whole or in part. The classic example was the old Soviet Constitution. If you may recall, the Constitution as written seemed to be pretty good, provided for all the rights, powers, duties, so forth that the U.S. Constitution does. But the Soviets invented an interesting system. For every official, there was a party official that stood by his side and made all the real decisions. So formally, they were constitutional, yet informally, they were not. And a lot of other countries have done similar things. So you can formally comply with the Constitution and yet substantively violate it. And as I'll go into in further lectures, that's something of what the situation we have in the United States, where for the most part the forms are observed, but a lot of the substance is not.
Just following up on the last comment, it seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that at some point you changed from descriptive of historical evolution of our constitutions, and generally in ours in particular, and then went into the sort of the aspirational mode of what you think the Constitution or our Constitution should be. What I mean is that I study constitutional law with some fairly decent scholars, who are well-known scholars, and their views, at least as they were supported to the students, were different in some significant ways from yours. And so, what I want to be clear, are you suggesting that these views, for example, in militia, private prosecutions, etc., are universally or generally accepted as the way things should be, or the way you think things should be?
They generally represent what was accepted in the founding era. So the differences are mainly the result of change over time. So I will generally base most of what I'm saying on the founding era, either for this country or, for that matter, other countries, because they have problems also of deviating from original meaning of their constitutions. We have this problem in the state level. We have it in private organizations, corporations. It's a perennial problem, but it's most useful for purposes of analysis to go back to the original state of things when constitutions and laws are first enacted. Now, if deviation from that occurs, then one can conduct a discussion about whether the deviation was appropriate and whether it return to the original meaning should be made, or perhaps the original amended. But if there's going to be a tension between original meaning and current practice, then that at least needs to be identified and examined with a view to whether or not the tension needs to be removed.
Do you think that when that tension comes into being between original meaning and interpretation, that any deviation from original meaning should not be left to judges, but rather should be done by amendment?
Well, the decisions of judges should not be treated as though they were provisions of the Constitution, because court decisions are not one of the methods of amendment. Now, that doesn't mean that judges can't make decisions. That's part of their job. And just as an umpire can make a call in a sporting they may get it right, they may get it wrong. But what you don't want to have is a wrong call becoming a change in the rules, or being treated as a change in the rules. For that, you need to go back and change the rules. So that we'll get into that in a discussion of stare decisis.
Can we go back to the slide about exercise of rights versus delegated powers? I wanted to.
That one there.
Okay, so we talked about these as being sort of opposites of each other.
Compliments, yes.
Yes, okay. So, to me, they seem more like the direct and subcontracted versions of the same thing. For example, I have a right to self-defense, but I'm no good at it, so I'm glad to have professional police and military officials who do the job, A, much better than I am, and B, work together as a team. Is it a different sort of opposition that you're talking about here? How do they come into conflict?
Well, delegated powers are exercised by our agents.
Right, which is the
So this is
subcontractor.
essentially describing a principal-agent relationship.
Mhm.
And the principals, of course, are here. They may exercise powers or rights that have not been delegated. But if they delegated something, there may be a restriction on what they may do.
Hmm. And the delegation may be something that I didn't decide on myself. It might be, that's part of the deal when you come into the room.
That's
part of
right.
the contract.
Exactly. Leonard.
Just briefly, what will you be talking about next week?
I'm going to be elaborating on some of these concepts and getting down into the whole general area of compliance with the Constitution. Not so much over what needs to be done if a deviation occurs, but how a deviation can occur.
Will you be discussing any of the debates that went on around the table here in Pennsylvania?
Yep.
They discussed?
Yep, the ratification debates will be part of that.
You made a comment, social contract protects rights but not provides benefits. And you wanted to say that social contracts, the word was kind of appropriated by progressives to mean you get benefits, I guess. But could, hijack, okay. What?
Can't hear you.
That's my normative intersection
Is
there.
it possible for the social contract to allow for compensations? And by compensations, I don't necessarily mean just what my pocketbook money. But could the social contract allow for compensations for violations of rights, abuses of powers within a group?
Yes, yes. That, of course, it clearly does.
And maybe that's what benefits.
Yeah, that comes under remedies.
And so perhaps the progressives, what you call benefits, the progressives call benefits.
Well, their theory might be based upon the notion that the poor are poor because they had something that the rich took away from them. That they are victims of some kind of injury. So now that may be the case in some countries, in some situations. You can find countries today where the rich got rich by stealing from the poor. And they might have a just claim for a return of the wealth that they should have inherited. So it's not a simple argument. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they should all get housing and education and health care and food and everything else they might need to an unlimited degree.
That, I don't think that's that big of an argument.
Yeah.
What about the idea of delegation, though? I mean, private charity is something that I think you would say a person has a right, maybe has a right to. Maybe you wouldn't use that language, but it's
No.
definitely something that someone can do. Society allows someone to do.
Yeah.
And so, is
It
it
has,
possible?
there's no delegated power to prevent them.
But could you delegate? Could the people delegate their power of charity to the government?
Well, but see, you're already delegating your power of charity when you give to a private charity. If you want to
Yeah.
talk about government charities, then you're delegating other people's money.
Mhm.
Well, sure, but I mean, the whole idea of delegation assumes that, I mean, unless you require unanimity, you're automatically forcing some people to delegate things they don't consent to.
Absolutely.
So if
Mhm.
that's not necessarily a flaw in any particular instance of delegation, or that invalidates any particular instance of delegation.
Well, some kinds of redistribution are likely to occur incidental to legitimate functions of government. We'll get into that in a future lecture. So, for example, when you build a military base to defend the whole country from foreign invasion, you may be benefiting more people near the military base and private contractors that help build it and so forth. But that's acceptable as long as the whole reason for building the military base was not to channel public funds to those contractors. Okay, so there's a fine line between legitimate general welfare or general defense and favoring particular factions or groups or localities.
So, given that notion, one could make an argument that so-called Obamacare is legitimate for the reason that it's to everyone's benefit to have a healthy population. And if that statute promotes the general health, that's good for all of us on a variety of levels. I suspect you would disagree with that, but can't such an argument be made on the principle you just articulated?
Well, if everyone really did need health care and got it in that way, a case could be made for that. But they don't. This is not a case of a public good in which everyone really benefits and has to bear the cost. So it's a complex issue, which we may get into later, but that really deserves a lecture unto itself.
I'm just curious if you have children.
No. You're all my children.
Wait, haven't we lost link one in the social contract?
Not everyone needs military bases
No.
either. You don't really need them until you need them.
Mhm.
That's a lot like healthcare.
John, I'd argue that it is a necessity or it's a right to have health care for all, at least at the basic level of preventive care where everyone can go yearly for a physical, because I know all the studies support that if anything is found early medically, it's greater than 95, 98% that they can treat it and cure it. So that's why I would say it's good for society, good for the welfare of our community and our country that everyone has that access to get in there, discovered early. Now I agree, like advanced things, like specialized things. I would say that something that's like really expensive. I don't think people necessarily have rights to that. But something that's protecting the general welfare of the country, which I think includes preventive care, which means a physical every year, I would argue we do have a right to that.
Well, let's go back to the founding and figure out what people thought at the time. Militia were sometimes used for things like caring for the ill until they could recover and get back to work. Generally speaking, if somebody had smallpox, then somebody who had already had smallpox and was immune was assigned to taking care of that person until they could become productive again or passed on. That was considered a legitimate militia function. But the key nexus there is that the person was considered worthy of care if they could contribute to the society as militia typically. And if it was a disease that might spread. So a contagious disease becomes an external threat, justifying a militia response. Therefore, things like quarantines and such. Again, there's a fine line. And generally the line is drawn at people are expected to take care of themselves to the extent that they can. If they can't, the standard model is private charity, or at least public charity at the state level. Now, a lot of these things, there is authority at the state level to do it, and not at the federal level. So, Romney Care in Massachusetts is constitutional. Obamacare at the federal level is not,
Why?
because there's no delegated authority to do that, to regulate or provide medical services or insurance. Medical services and insurance is not commerce, as originally understood.
So you're suggesting that the reason that Obamacare is unconstitutional is that it overly stretches the Commerce Clause to do something which originally was not the intent of the Commerce Clause?
Exactly.
Okay.
Originally, commerce meant only trade in tangible commodities, stuff that you can pick up and hold in your hands.
The Congress is, from time to time, to pass laws and so forth. So are they,
But they have to be constitutional. The laws have to be constitutional.
Right, they have to be authorized by the meta law, the supreme law.
What was it wrong that say that it was constitutional
Because it was a tax.
they had the right, Congress had the right to issue a tax?
Well, he was only talking about the individual mandate, and he decided it was a tax.
And Congress has the right to.
Yeah, however, there's a problem with that because the original concept of tax restricts the power to proper taxable objects. And the individual mandate becomes a tax on not doing something.
Mm.
And if there can be a tax on not doing something, then, for example, I, as a government, could impose a tax of $1 billion on you for failing to part your hair on the left. And if you inadvertently parted it on the right, impose a tax bill on you of $1 billion and throw you in jail when you can't pay it.
Yes, that's called a slippery slope argument. And is that true that, mandating that people pay for health insurance is equivalent to taxing non-activity? I don't see that.
Taxing non-action, yes.
I'm having a hard time seeing that.
What you failed to do was buy the product.
Yeah,
Maybe it's not a product, maybe it's a.
it's a service technically.
It's not a product, it's a necessity. That-
But it's not a
like
necessity.
when you don't pay
It's
for it.
necessity for Obamacare to work.
So like when you don't pay for it and you go to the emergency room and, and then get treatment and I have to pay for that, it's not a tangible product.
But you only have to pay for it because the government requires the hospital to treat
The
you.
service isn't actual, it's not a tangible chair, but the service is a commodity, it is a thing.
Yeah, but you only impose a burden on others because the hospital is required to treat you.
So,
If it was like Mexico or some other country where you have to pay in advance before you get medical care, then it wouldn't be a problem.
well, you have to go, that's not the issue, that's not the argument. The argument is that it's a burden to society not to have a systematic way to pay for people's health care that becomes inevitable. I mean, everybody will need health care at some point in their life,
Yeah, well, there is a way. Everybody can pay for his own.
but people don't.
Well, if they don't, then they don't get it.
So you're saying then that we should just not have, you're saying we should not, the hospitals should not be required to treat?
Exactly.
So but does that still make it unconstitutional that the hospitals are required to treat.
Well,
So
the
they're
federal statute requiring it is unconstitutional.
requiring that hospitals.
Right. The state statute requiring it is not. But the state statute, if it requires it, the state is obligated to pay for it.
What about the intercommerce? And that pertains to the intercommerce situation. You know,
It's not commerce.
I'm a member,
As
I'm
Ruth understood.
Texan, but I happen to go to.
I want to change that non-commerce point, because it's a novel one to me. The idea that some of the things we are accustomed to buying and selling wouldn't have been classified as commerce in the original language. I
They-
mean,
They weren't.
well, okay, so I mean, I don't own a home, and so I don't pay property tax except indirectly.
Mhm.
That is, I pay rent. My
Mhm.
landlord pays property tax. Would it be, would my rent payment be untaxable? I'm buying something.
Well, that doesn't, taxability and commerce are two different issues. It doesn't have to be commerce to be taxable.
Okay, but it does have to be commerce.
To
for
be
the tax To be
regulatable.
constitutional at the federal level.
It has to be regulatable at the federal level.
Referring to universal medical care, if you compress it to detailed universal medical care and can make it constitutional, if you take the case of the state of California going near bankruptcy for medical access to its Los Angeles hospitals, consider Mexico, consider amoeba. Everybody is in danger of having amoebic dysentery, which is monstrous. Everybody, in my opinion, should be tested for it. Every single member of society, according to Jeremy Bentham's idea. Make it constitutional. Not pay for everything, but for a few things that are really
And
imperative
the
for
state can
survival.
state can do that
Amoeba.
under most state constitutions.
But is that according to the
But
state?
the federal
And
government-
That's federal?
The federal
How does
constitution
that-
has no such
How
authority.
does that differ from the fact that somebody maybe have brain damage from an amoeba swimming in a lake, where everybody swimming in that lake needs to be tested for it, but the government won't pay for it because it's not constitutional? Isn't that?
No, it's a hazard of living.
Mhm.
I think that there's two issues here. There's kind of the issue of what particular power does the federal government have versus the states. That's one
Yep.
issue. But I think your lecture deals more with the foundational issues of
Yes.
what are the proper limits of any government, whether
Right.
federal or state. And I get the sense that some of your answers to the questions are the federal government can't do it, but the state can.
Right.
Because that just re-raises the question, which is, should the state government do it?
Yes.
And I think that's what John's question is getting at.
Yeah.
Some of the other questions are, should government?
Well, we're getting into the weeds here of our particulars of the U.S. system, and we can do that in a future lecture. We've run out of time here today, so.
Okay, next week, then off for Thanksgiving, then one more after Thanksgiving.